The mechanic's garage smelled like motor oil and Sunday morning coffee when Marcus Webb walked in wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big and boots held together with duct tape. And the room went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before someone gets hurt. "We don't do charity work here," said Dean Ashford, not looking up from the cherry-red Mustang he was polishing for the cameras. Dean owned Ashford Performance, the biggest name in vintage restoration on this side of the state, and he had a film crew following him around for a local business spotlight. "This is a shop for people who understand cars, not for people who look like they slept under one." The small crowd of customers and onlookers laughed. Someone's phone came up, already recording. Marcus said nothing. He set down a canvas tool bag, cracked and faded at the corners, and looked at the Mustang's engine like he was reading a letter from an old friend. "I heard you fix transmissions," Marcus said quietly. Dean smirked at the camera. "I heard you probably fix bicycles." More laughter. A young apprentice near the tool wall, no older than 19, winced and looked away, embarrassed on behalf of a stranger. Marcus didn't flinch. He picked up a wrench from the bench, not his own, turned it once in his weathered hand like he was checking its balance, and set it back down exactly where it had been. "Your torque converter's been slipping for 3 weeks, Marcus said. "That's why she stutters at 40. The garage went still. Dean's jaw tightened. "Get out of my shop." But in the back corner, an old man in a grease-stained cap named Walter Higgs, who had swept these floors for 30 years, and remembered more than anyone gave him credit for, lowered his broom and stared at Marcus's hands. Steady. Calloused in a very particular way along the first 2 knuckles, the kind of callus you only got from one thing. Walter's breath caught. He had seen those hands before, a long time ago, on television, on a stage under bright lights, holding a trophy that didn't exist anymore. But he said nothing, not yet. He just watched. Dean Ashford loved being watched. It was the reason he'd built glass walls into his office so customers could see him, at work. The reason he wore a leather jacket in July. The reason there was a camera crew trailing him this particular Saturday morning for a segment called Local Legends, Masters of the Trade. He had spent 15 years turning Ashford Performance into the loudest name in 3 counties, and loud to Dean meant important. He circled Marcus slowly now, performing for the lens the way a rooster struts for hens. "Let me guess," Dean said. "You used to work on cars, real cars. Somewhere important, and now you're here in my shop telling me my equipment is broken." "I didn't say your equipment," Marcus said. "I said your converter." "Same thing, old man." The crowd chuckled again, but it was thinner this time. A woman near the entrance, holding her daughter's hand, didn't laugh at all. She watched Marcus's face, which had not changed once. No anger, no shame, no plea for mercy. Just the stillness of someone who had been through worse rooms than this one. Dean gestured to the Mustang. "You know what this car is worth? $200,000. A 1967 fastback, numbers matching, restored down to the factory bolts. And you're telling me that I don't know my own converter." "I'm telling you it's slipping," Marcus said. "Test it yourself. 40 miles an hour, listen for the shudder." "I don't need to test anything. I've been doing this since before you probably learned to tie your shoes." Dean turned to the camera and grinned. "Folks, this is what we deal with. Every week, somebody wanders in off the street thinking they know more than a certified master technician. It's almost sad." He said the word sad, the way people say it when they mean the opposite, when they mean funny, when they mean watch me enjoy this. Marcus reached into his canvas bag, not for a weapon, not for anything dramatic. He pulled out a small notebook, its cover worn soft as cloth, and a stub of pencil, and he wrote something down without looking up. "What are you doing?" Dean asked. "Writing me a complaint letter." "Writing down what I hear," Marcus said. "Habit." Walter in the back felt something cold move down his spine. He remembered a man who used to do exactly that. Write down every sound an engine made before he ever touched a bolt. There had only been one man like that Walter had ever known. And that man had vanished off the face of the racing world 19 years ago, after the worst night of his life, and nobody had heard from him since. The bag was the first clue. Old canvas, hand-stitched at one seam, the kind of repair only someone who respected a tool would bother making. The second clue was the hands, steady, unshaking, a stillness that didn't belong to a nervous stranger, but to someone who had spent a lifetime under pressure, until pressure stopped meaning anything. The third clue came when Dean, growing impatient with his own audience's uncertain silence, decided to make an example. "Tell you what," Dean said, spreading his arms for the crowd. "You think you know engines, prove it. There's a customer car in Bay 3, transmissions locked up, 3 shops before mine gave up on it. If you can diagnose it in under 2 minutes, correctly, in front of everybody here, I'll let you sweep my floors for a living. If you're wrong," he smiled at the camera, "you walk out and never come back." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The young apprentice, whose name was Danny, looked at Walter with wide eyes, silently asking if this was actually happening. Marcus looked at the crowd for the first time. Not at Dean. At the ordinary faces watching him, tired faces, curious faces, a few faces that clearly wanted him to lose because a stranger losing was easier to laugh at than a stranger being right. "Okay," Marcus said. Bay 3 held a pale blue sedan, hood already up, belts and hoses hanging loose from 3 previous attempts. Dean folded his arms and let the silence stretch, confident, performing patience for the camera like a man who already knew the outcome. Marcus walked to the car without hurrying. He did not touch a single tool. He placed 2 fingers on the engine block, closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds and listened to nothing at all because the engine was off. Someone snickered. "He's feeling it," Dean said to the camera, delighted. "Folks, he's feeling the car's energy." Marcus opened his eyes, started. Danny, nervous, turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, ran rough, a low grinding shudder underneath the idle that most ears would miss entirely. "Torque converters seized against the flex plate," Marcus said. "Bolt backed out 8, maybe 10,000 miles ago. It's been walking loose ever since, chewing metal a little more each time it heats up. That's your locked transmission, not the transmission at all." The garage went silent in a different way now, not mocking silence, uncertain silence. Dean's smile faltered for half a second before he caught himself. "Lucky guess. Pull the pan," Marcus said. "You'll find metal shavings in a spiral pattern, heaviest on the passenger side because the bolt backed out clockwise." Dean hesitated. Then, because the camera was still rolling and pride does not know how to retreat gracefully, he nodded at Danny. "Pull it." It took 11 minutes. The crowd didn't leave. Nobody spoke. When the pan came loose and the fluid drained into the catch bin, there they were, metal shavings, curled in a long spiral, heaviest exactly where Marcus had said. The room exhaled all at once, like it had been holding its breath the whole time without realizing it. Dean's face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: disbelief, calculation, and finally a kind of forced, brittle amusement that fooled no one. "Coincidence," Dean said, too fast. "Anybody could have guessed that with enough experience." But in the back corner, Walter Higgs had stopped breathing entirely. Because he now remembered exactly where he'd seen this trick before. Not a trick, a signature. A method so precise it used to be called on national broadcasts nearly 2 decades ago. Diagnosing by ear. A skill that had belonged to exactly one driver-mechanic in the history of the American endurance circuit, a man who built and drove his own cars, who could hear a failing part through a running engine the way a doctor hears an irregular heartbeat. A man named Cole Rennick. A man who had disappeared after the Melbourne 500, the night his own car exploded on the final lap under suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated. The night his sponsor pulled out, his reputation collapsed, and rumors spread that he had cheated. Rumors that were never once proven but destroyed him anyway. Walter's hands were shaking now. He looked at Marcus Webb's face again. 19 years older, thinner, grayer. But the eyes calm, patient, carrying something heavy that never quite left them. Those eyes belonged to a ghost Walter had thought was dead. Dean wasn't finished. Humiliated men rarely know when to stop, because stopping feels like defeat and defeat in front of a camera feels like death. One lucky diagnosis doesn't make you a mechanic, Dean announced, raising his voice for the room. Let's really test this. We've got the Mustang. Numbers matching, one of a kind, worth more than most people's houses. You want to prove yourself? Drive her, right now. Show us you know what you're doing behind the wheel, not just standing around playing detective. It was a trap and everyone could feel it. A $200,000 classic, temperamental, notoriously difficult to handle, being handed to a stranger in worn boots specifically so he would stall it, grind the gears, embarrass himself in front of the lens Dean had been performing for all morning. Dean, maybe that's not, the shop's general manager, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Chandrasekharan, started to say before Dean cut her off with a look. It's fine, Priya, it's a demonstration. He turned to Marcus. Unless you're scared. Marcus looked at the Mustang for a long moment. Then he looked at Walter and something passed between them, not recognition spoken aloud but recognition felt, the way two people who have survived the same fire know each other without needing names. I'll drive it, Marcus said quietly, on one condition. Name it. You ride with me. The crowd murmured. Dean's confidence flickered again. Riding along meant he couldn't control the narrative afterward, couldn't claim the stranger had cheated or gotten lucky out of sight. But refusing, in front of his own camera crew, would look like fear. Fine, Dean said. Let's go. They pulled out of the garage lot and onto the frontage road behind it, a long straight stretch normally used for test drives. Empty at this hour, except for a line of orange cones marking a makeshift course Danny had set up weeks ago for his own practice runs. Marcus adjusted the seat by feel, not by looking. He adjusted the mirrors the same way. He rested both hands on the wheel, that specific 10 and 2 the old racing schools used to teach before everyone switched to 9 and 3. And for one moment, before the engine even turned over, his eyes closed. What are you doing now? Dean asked, irritation creeping back into his voice. Praying. Remembering, Marcus said. He turned the key. The Mustang's engine roared to life, and something in the sound was different than it had been all morning. Tighter, cleaner, like the car itself recognized a hand it hadn't felt in a long time. What happened over the next 4 minutes would later be described a dozen different ways by a dozen different witnesses, but everyone agreed on the essential facts. Marcus took the cone course at a speed that should have been reckless in a car that heavy, that old, that unforgiving. And yet every turn was controlled, every shift smooth, the tires never once screaming in protest. He wasn't showing off. There was no drama in it, no fishtailing for effect, no roaring acceleration for the camera. It was precise, economical, the driving of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. It became instinct instead of skill. Dean, in the passenger seat, gripped the door handle so hard his knuckles went white, and said nothing at all. When Marcus brought the car to a smooth stop back in front of the garage, the small crowd that had gathered, now grown larger, drawn by phones and word of mouth, didn't laugh, didn't cheer either. They just stared, the way people stare at something they don't yet have words for. Marcus turned off the engine, removed the key, set it gently on the dash. Torque converter's fine on this one, he said quietly, but your rear differential's due for fluid in about 800 miles. You'll hear a whine on tight left turns before then. He got out of the car and closed the door softly, like closing a door in a house where someone was sleeping. Dean climbed out on the other side, and for the first time all morning, he didn't have anything to say to the camera. His publicist, a young man named Tyler who had been standing near the entrance the whole time, phone constantly buzzing, was already whispering urgently in his ear about optics and damage control. But Dean waved him off, trying to reclaim the room the only way he knew how. Anyone can drive a car in a straight line, Dean said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. That doesn't prove anything. That was when Walter Higgs finally stepped forward. He moved slowly, the way old men move when their knees have given 40 years of service and expect to be asked politely. He stopped a few feet from Marcus and studied his face the way you'd study a photograph you hadn't seen in decades, searching for the parts that time hadn't changed. "Cole," Walter said. The garage went utterly silent. Marcus, or Cole, if that was truly his name, closed his eyes briefly, like a man setting down a weight he had carried a very long way. "Nobody's called me that in 19 years, he said. A young woman near the front, phone still raised, whispered to the person next to her, "Who's Cole?" Walter turned to face the crowd, and for the first time in 30 years of quietly sweeping this garage's floors, he raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This man," Walter said, his voice cracking with the weight of it, "is Cole Rennick, 3-time national endurance champion. The only driver-mechanic in the history of the circuit who built his own engines from scratch and still beat teams with 10 times his budget. He was the best there ever was, and then, 19 years ago at the Melbourne 500, his engine exploded on the final lap and everybody said he cheated. Everybody said he rigged his own car for insurance money. They took his championship. They took his sponsors. They took his name out of the record books like he never existed. Danny, the young apprentice, had gone pale. Wait, the Cole Rennick, from the documentary. There was never a proper investigation," Walter continued. "No proof. Just rumors started by people who wanted him gone, and a sponsor's lawyer who found it cheaper to blame the driver than admit the fuel line they'd installed was faulty. Cole never fought it, never defended himself in public. He just," Walter's voice broke, "he just disappeared. And I always wondered what happened to him. Every phone in the garage was still recording, but nobody was laughing now. The room had the hush of a church between hymns. Dean's face had drained of all its earlier bravado. That's not possible. Cole Rennick would be, he'd have money, he'd have nothing," Marcus said, speaking for himself now quietly, "if the people who ruined him made sure of it. The truth came out slowly after that, the way water finds cracks in old stone." Marcus Cole didn't tell the story with drama. He told it the way a man tells a story he has finally stopped being ashamed of, plainly, without asking for sympathy. The fuel line that failed on the final lap of the Melbourne 500 had not been his own work. It had been installed 3 days before the race by a subcontracted crew hired by his sponsor at the time, a company called Halbrook Motorsport Group, after Cole had specifically flagged the part for replacement and been told in writing that it had already been done. When the engine caught fire on the final turn, Cole had been pulled from the wreck, with second-degree burns across his left forearm, and while he was still in the hospital, Halbrook's lawyers had already drafted a statement blaming driver negligence. Because admitting a maintenance failure would have voided their insurance and triggered a lawsuit from 3 other teams. Cole had fought it, quietly, for 8 months. He'd hired an independent investigator with what savings he had left. But Halbrook had money and lawyers and a public relations machine, and Cole had a hospital bill and a burned arm that still ached when it rained. In the end, the sanctioning body issued a vague, unsatisfying ruling, inconclusive, driver responsibility not ruled out, which in the world of sponsorships and reputation was as good as a guilty verdict. No sponsor would touch him after that. No team would hire him. The man who could diagnose an engine failure by sound alone couldn't get hired to change oil. He'd spent the next 19 years the way a lot of quietly ruined men do, working small jobs under different names, moving from town to town. Never staying long enough for anyone to ask too many questions, never racing again, never even watching a race on television if he could help it. "Why come here?" Dean asked, and for the first time his voice held something other than arrogance. It held the beginning of fear. "Why this garage? Why today?" Marcus reached into his canvas bag one more time. This time he pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft with age, creased along the same lines so many times it had nearly split apart. He unfolded it carefully and held it out, not to Dean but to Priya, the manager, whose hands trembled as she took it. It was an old service invoice, 19 years old. The letterhead read Halbrook Motorsport Group. And the signature at the bottom, authorizing the fuel line replacement that was never actually performed, belonged to a young technician named Dean Ashford. The garage seemed to tilt on its axis. "You," Cole said, and for the only time that morning something sharp entered his voice, though he never raised it, "were 23 years old, fresh out of tech school. Your boss told you to sign off on work you hadn't done because the parts hadn't arrived yet and the race couldn't wait. You did it because you were scared of losing your job. I understand that. I've never hated you for that." Dean's mouth opened and closed without sound. "What I never understood," Cole continued, "is how the boy who signed that piece of paper became a man who built an entire career out of humiliating strangers for a camera. I looked you up before I came here today, Dean. Your business, your interviews, the way you talk about people who don't have what you have." He folded the paper back up gently like something sacred. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came here because I heard, through people who still remember me, that a garage under your name had a habit of embarrassing the people who walk in looking like I do. And I wanted to see it with my own eyes before I decided what to do about it." The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room permanently. Priya Chandrasekaran, who had spent 3 years as Dean's general manager watching him perform cruelty as entertainment, and saying nothing because her rent depended on her paycheck, finally found the courage that had been buried under fear for so long. "I've watched you do this to people for 3 years, she said to Dean, her voice shaking but clear. "The delivery driver last spring, the woman who brought in her late husband's truck and didn't know the terminology. I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything. I was wrong." She turned to the crowd, to the cameras, to Cole. "I'm sorry I never said anything sooner." "You're not the one who owes an apology," Cole said gently. Danny, the young apprentice, stepped forward next, his voice barely above a whisper. Would you teach me what you did with the sound, the listening? Nobody's ever shown me that." Cole looked at him for a long moment and something in his tired eyes softened. "Someday," he said. "Not today. Today isn't about that." It was Tyler, Dean's own publicist, who made the call that finally ended it, not out of loyalty to truth, but because he understood, faster than Dean did, that the footage rolling on a dozen phones in that garage was no longer a story about a rude mechanic. It was a story about fraud, negligence, and a stolen championship, and stories like that didn't stay contained. Within the hour, he'd reached out to the show's producers and to someone else, a name Cole hadn't heard spoken aloud in 19 years. Harold Voss arrived a little after noon. He was 71 years old, walked with a cane, and had spent the last 2 decades as chairman of the very sanctioning body that had once issued the ambiguous ruling against Cole. He had been, back then, a young board member who had voted against the vague finding, one of only 2 who had, and who had never stopped believing the whole thing smelled wrong. He walked into the garage slowly, looked at the man standing among the crowd, and stopped as if the years had physically weight. "Cole Rennick," Harold said, his voice thick. "I have spent 19 years wondering if you were even alive." "Barely some years," Cole said honestly. Harold held up his phone, on which Tyler had already sent him the video, the invoice, everything. "I've had this document in my personal files for years, a copy anyway. I never had the original. Halbrook made sure of that, but I always knew. I just never had proof strong enough to reopen the case." He looked at the folded paper in Priya's hands. "That, combined with what's already been recorded here today, might finally be enough." He turned to Dean, and his voice hardened in a way that 71 years of quiet dignity could summon far more effectively than any shouting. "Mr. Ashford, I don't know what kind of man you've become, and frankly, after watching parts of this footage on the drive over, I'm not sure I want to. But I do know this. The sanctioning body has the authority to formally reopen the Milbourne 500 investigation, and given what you just handed us, your own signature, on the record admitting work that was never done, I expect it will not take 19 years to conclude this time." Dean said nothing. There was nothing left to say. His publicist had already stepped outside to take a call from someone at the network overseeing the Local Legends segment, And the tone of that call, audible faintly through the open door, was not the tone of a man defending his client. Cole didn't watch Dean's collapse. He didn't need to. He had spent 19 years learning that a man's downfall, when it came from truth instead of vengeance, didn't need an audience to be complete. He turned instead to the crowd, the ordinary people who, an hour earlier, had laughed along with a bully because laughing along was easier than standing up. He didn't blame them for that. He understood it better than anyone in the room. "I want to say something," Cole said, and his voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the garage. "Not about him." He didn't look at Dean. "About the rest of you." The room held its breath. 19 years ago, I was the best at what I did. And in one night, a piece of paper and a room full of people who decided it, was easier to believe a rumor than to ask a question took that away from me. Not because I did anything wrong, because it was convenient for them to believe I did. He paused, and for the first time all morning, something like pain crossed his face, brief and honest. "I spent a long time believing the room was right, that if everyone in a place decides who you are, maybe that's just who you are now. It took me a long time to understand something simpler than that." He looked at Danny, at Priya, at the woman near the entrance still holding her daughter's hand. "The room does not decide who you are," Cole said. "It never did. It just decides who gets to speak first." He picked up his canvas bag from where he'd set it down that morning. "Steel has no opinion of you," he said. "An engine doesn't care what you're wearing, or how much money you have, or whether the crowd is laughing at you. It only cares whether you're telling the truth about what's broken. I learned more about honesty from machines than I ever did from people. Maybe that's sad. Maybe that's just true." He turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back one more time, not at Dean, but at the whole room. "Don't let their laughter become your voice," he said. "It took me 19 years to stop hearing it in my own head. Don't give anybody that many years of your life for free." And then he walked out into the parking lot, into the ordinary sunlight of an ordinary Saturday, leaving behind a garage that would never be quite the same. The weeks that followed unfolded the way truth usually does once it finally gets loose, slowly, and then all at once. The video from that morning, uploaded by no fewer than 6 different phones, spread faster than anyone at Ashford Performance could have controlled. Not because of drama or spectacle, but because something in it was simply, undeniably real, a quiet man proving himself without raising his voice, an old injustice finally seeing daylight. News outlets that had never heard of Cole Rennick before that Saturday were suddenly running his name in headlines again, this time with a different word attached to it. Not disgraced. Wronged. The sanctioning body's reopened investigation moved with unusual speed, propelled by public attention and Harold Voss's insistence. And within 6 weeks, it concluded what Halbrook Motorsport Group had spent 19 years and considerable legal fees preventing anyone from concluding officially. The fuel line failure that ended Cole Rennick's career had been the result of documented maintenance fraud, not driver negligence. His championship title, stripped so long ago, was formally reinstated. Halbrook Motorsport Group, long since restructured under a different name, issued a statement that apologized to almost no one and satisfied even fewer, but it didn't matter anymore. The record books had already been corrected. The truth had already found its way home. Dean Ashford did not go to prison. Fraud from 19 years prior, committed by a 23-year-old under direct pressure from a since-dissolved company, wasn't the kind of thing courts moved quickly on, and Cole, true to the promise he'd made in that garage, never pushed for punishment beyond the truth being known. But truth turned out to be punishment enough. Ashford Performance lost its biggest sponsorship deals within a month. The Local Legends segment was quietly pulled from production. Dean sold the shop 18 months later to a buyer nobody in town ever met, and moved out of state, and the sign above the garage door came down on a gray Tuesday morning that nobody bothered to film. Priya Chandrasekaran became the new owner, at Cole's quiet suggestion, and with a loan she'd spent years too afraid to ask for. She renamed the shop within the first month. A small sign now hung above the door reading simply Higgs and Rennick Automotive, though neither Walter nor Cole had asked for their names on it. Priya had insisted. "Some debts," she said, "you pay by remembering." Walter Higgs, 74 years old, finally retired his broom. Not because he wanted to stop working, but because Priya made him head of quality inspection instead, a job that mostly involved him sitting in a chair by the garage bay drinking coffee, and occasionally shouting corrections at younger mechanics who'd gotten a torque spec wrong. He seemed, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, genuinely happy. Danny got his lessons after all, every Wednesday evening after the shop closed. Cole would sit with him at the workbench and teach him to listen, not with tools, not at first, just with his ears, and his patience, the way an old teacher had once taught a young Cole Rennick a lifetime ago. Before rooms and rumors and other people's convenience had tried to take it all away. 6 months later, on a warm afternoon in early autumn, a regional charity event brought together mechanics, drivers, and enthusiasts from across 3 counties for an exhibition day at the old Milbourne Speedway, the same track where Cole's career had ended in fire and silence 19 years before. It was the first time he'd agreed to set foot on that asphalt since. He wasn't there to race. He was there because Harold Voss had asked him, gently, if he would consider something else entirely. Judging the Young Mechanics Technical Exhibition, a small program built for teenagers from underfunded schools who'd never otherwise get near a professional garage, let alone a real racetrack. Danny was there too, 18 now, competing in his division with a confidence that hadn't existed in him 6 months earlier, when he'd been a nervous apprentice too afraid to contradict a bully in his own shop. Cole stood at the edge of the pit lane that afternoon, wearing the same worn jacket he'd had on the day everything changed, watching a row of teenagers nervously present their diagnostic work to a panel of judges. One girl, no older than 15, misdiagnosed an engine issue entirely, got flustered, and looked like she might cry in front of the small crowd gathered to watch. Cole walked over quietly, crouched beside her workstation, and said something none of the microphones caught, though everyone standing nearby would later swear it was something about steel and opinions and rooms that don't get to decide who you are. The girl wiped her eyes, nodded, and tried again. This time she got it right. Somewhere in the stands, Walter Higgs, sitting beside Priya with a cup of coffee he was technically not supposed to have because of his blood pressure, smiled and said quietly, mostly to himself, "There he is. 19 years, and there he finally is." Because the man standing in the pit lane that afternoon wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't proving anything to a crowd, or defending a title, or settling an old score. He was simply doing what he had always done best, long before fame and long after its loss, kneeling beside someone who felt small, and reminding them quietly that they weren't. The sun caught the old scars along his left forearm as he stood back up. And for just a moment before he turned to walk to the next station, he looked exactly like what Walter had always known him to be underneath every ounce of humiliation the world had tried to bury him in. Not a legend, not a champion. Just a man who had never once stopped believing that the truth, however long it took, would eventually come home to the people patient enough to wait for it. And somewhere out past the empty grandstands, where the wind moved quietly across 19 years of silence, the track that once took everything from him finally sounded, for the first time in a very long while, like it was welcoming him back.